Now that we have an app service plan, we can create app services on it. You can add those from a few places. On the left menu, I have a shortcut that shows all the existing app services in my subscription. You can see they each have their own app service plan, but they're both on the free app service plan tier, which has limited features. I could create a new app service from here, or I could go to Create a Resource at the top of the menu, like I did when creating the app service plan. Or you can go to All Services and search for App Service. There it is, so let's click it. And this actually brings us back to the same view you saw when I clicked the shortcut on the left menu for the app services. So if you don't have a favorite pinned to the menu for this service, that's how you get to it. I'll click the Create button. And the first thing we need to do is select the resource group to create this app service plan in. You could create a new one, but let's put it in the same resource group as the app service plan. And now we need to give the web app a name. And this name needs to be unique across all of Azure, not just your subscription. And that's because Azure will create a URL from this that's suffixed with azurewebsites.net. This name will work. So the next thing is the type of deployment we want to do. You can choose from code, container, or static web app. A code deployment is your typical deployment of your compiled ASP.NET Core application. You need to select the runtime stack though. And you can see there are a variety of languages available. We want the latest version of .NET and ASP.NET Core. When you choose the runtime stack, you can select the type of operating system that it's supported on. For .NET and .NET Core, you can choose Windows or Linux. Not all frameworks support both. Now, we'll circle back to the other publishing options like containers, but first, let's look at the App Service Plan selection. We created an App Service Plan earlier, but it's not showing in this drop-down list. And that's because the region defaulted to East US for this app service, but that's not where we created the App Service Plan. So if I change this region to Canada Central, now the existing plan is showing, and we can select it. There's actually some other ones in this region that I created for other courses. And notice we can create a new app service plan from here also. If you don't already have an app service plan that you want to add another app service to, you can just create the app service plan at the same time as the app service. And you can choose the pricing tier at the same time. Now let's look at the other publish types. You can publish a Docker container, and that's available on Linux or Windows. But notice that even though Windows is selected, and the region is Canada Central, we have to create a new app service plan. You can't deploy code and containers on the same app service plan, and you can only create an app service plan for containers while creating the app service. Static web app is actually a different kind of app. It's not really an app service. It's meant for web apps that don't need server-side processing, so they don't need ASP.NET 6 on the server. You actually use Azure Functions for your server-side processing. Static web apps are created on a different screen, and there's a link here for that. They're just included on this App Service Create screen so that you know that they're an alternative, depending on your requirements. Okay, let's change this back to code, and let's move on to the next screen. If you want to create a database at the same time, you need to create a new app service plan on the previous screen. This will give you the ability to create an Azure SQL database, a PostgreSQL database, a MySQL database, or a Cosmos DB database right from this screen. The corresponding resources will get created in Azure for you, including the required networking to reach the database. Let's move on to the next screen. Here you can set up continuous deployment of your code from a repository in GitHub using GitHub Actions. Remember, Microsoft bought GitHub a few years ago, so there's pretty tight integration. This will require authenticating to GitHub, and a GitHub Actions workflow will get created in the repository in GitHub, and the credentials to authenticate will be added as a GitHub secret. You can do this later though, and we'll look at continuous deployment later in this course. So let's move on to networking. On this screen, you can set up the type of integration with an Azure Virtual Network that I talked about earlier in this module. We can do all this after the app service has been created though, so let's move on. On the monitoring screen, you can enable Application Insights. This is a service in Azure that provides deep monitoring of your application, including things like user locations and traffic patterns. You can monitor the app from outside, or you can include a package in your application code for even deeper integration with Application Insights. That's an entire subject unto itself, so let's turn it off for our purposes of learning about deployment. And on the tag screen, you can add tags to make it easier to manage your resources. These help with searching and billing and anywhere you need to filter Azure resources. Let's skip ahead though and create this app service. It says the resource has been created, so let's explore the created app service in the next clip. The app service has been created. Now let's explore it a bit. We could go to the resource from the creation screen here, but you can get to the app services from the shortcut on the left menu at any time. It shows as being in its own app service plan in the Canada Central region and running on the standard pricing tier. Let's navigate into it. I'll just collapse the menu with the list of app services and create some room here. On the overview page, you can see things like the URL to the app service, and if there was a custom domain name assigned, it would show here also. The resource group name is here, and the region the app service was created in. There's information about the app service plan that the app service is hosted on also. On the monitoring tab, there are charts here showing things like the amount of data that's moved into and out of the app service, as well as the number of HTTP errors. Azure App Service has extensive logging capabilities, which you can configure from here or from the menu on the left. The Capabilities tab shows some of the features of the app service, and we'll look closer at those on the left menu shortly. Notifications shows any notifications from Azure about the resource. Here it's suggesting to enable application insights for detailed monitoring. And on the Recommendations tab, it shows any recommendations from Azure Advisor, which is tailored to your instance of app service. We don't have any recommendations though, so let's look at the menu on the left. Environment Variables is where you can configure application settings and connection strings. These are just name-value pairs of variables used by your application. If the name is the same as a name in the appsettings.json file of your ASP.NET Core application, then that value will get overridden by the value set here. There's also an option to make this application setting stay with the deployment slot that it's in. That way, when you swap versions of the application between deployment slots, the values for dev will stay with dev, and the values for prod will stay with prod, even though the code will get swapped. Leaving this box unchecked will swap the value here along with the code. Connection strings are similar, and they override the connection string section in your appsettings.json file. The connection string is also available as an environment variable at runtime, and when choosing the type, this will create a prefix on that environment variable. Let's see what else is in this configuration section. Under General Settings, you can change the language stack of your application. You can turn on WebSockets, and by default, Session Affinity is on. But you should turn this off if your application was built to be stateless, and requests can be handled by any server in the app service plan. You can also enable remote debugging from here, which will allow you to connect to your running app service from Visual Studio. You'll need to deploy the debug version of your code to app service though. We created the underlying app service plan for the Windows operating system, so we've got typical IIS functionality, like setting a default document. And you can even control the mapping and configure virtual applications and directories from here, just like in IIS Manager. It's possible to mount Azure Storage to be accessible from your app service. This lets you mount Azure file shares and premium file shares to your app service hosted on Windows, Linux, or on containers. For app service on Linux, you can also link to blob storage. You might mount Azure Storage in order to access static content like videos and images, or for custom logging, or to share content across multiple apps or with other Azure services. We're not going to make any changes here though, so let's go farther down the menu and take a look at custom domains. This is where you can set up your app service to use your own domain, so users don't need to go to the azurewebsites.net default domain. If you're hosting your domain outside of Azure, you can add some records in your DNS provider and validate the domain here to prove that you own it. Or you can buy an app service domain right here in the portal, and it will get hosted in the Azure DNS service. The domain registrar in that case is actually GoDaddy for app service domains, but it all gets managed by Azure and billed to your subscription. When you use the default Azure Websites domain, it runs on HTTPS and there's a built-in certificate. If you're assigning a custom domain, you'll need your own certificate for HTTPS traffic. App Service Managed certificates are available here, and they're actually free. There are some limitations though, like managed certificates don't support wildcard certificates, and the certificate is not exportable. Check the documentation for other limitations. If you own your own certificate and manage its renewal yourself, you can upload and use that here. Let's look at another tab on the menu, the Networking tab. This is where you can configure integration with virtual networks in Azure, as well as on-premises resources. We talked about these network integration features earlier in this module. You have access to a console for your app service, where you can do things like create directories and navigate the virtual file system that's stored on a network file share and shared by all the instances of the app service plan. Here, I'm just checking the .NET Framework version. On the Extensions tab, you can add extensions to this app service. There's quite a few here, some created by Microsoft and some by third-party providers. I've typically used this extensions feature to add beta versions of .NET Core when developing. Let's close out of this and look at a feature used by web APIs. The Cores tab lets you configure cross-origin resource sharing, which allows JavaScript running in a browser to interact with your backend web service here. This can solve connection problems with single-page applications and mobile apps. And API definition lets you configure the location of the Swagger document that describes your API, so it's discoverable by developers wanting to know how to use it. On the Metrics tab, you can access detailed metrics for your app service, like the average response time and amount of memory and CPU being used. The charts you saw on the Overview page come from here. And on the Logs menu, you can set up Log Analytics, which is a central store in Azure that different services can send log information to for searching and aggregation. And finally, on Diagnostic Settings, you can choose to send different types of logs to different places, like a Log Analytics workspace, a storage account, an event hub, or even to an outside logging solution that you might have in your organization. Let's stop there for now, and let's look at deployment slots in the next clip.